We had begun in last week's Limud Be'ezer Hashem to begin to analyze the Shita of Tosfos, as explained in the Sefer HaYoshar of Rabbeinu Tam, and as elaborated on by the Ar Sameach, by Rabbi Simcha, in the beginning of Perek Gimel of Hilchos Shabbos. That Tosfos' Shita is that the basis of the Isser of CHAZARA, without the kira being garif and kotum, and without the conditions of CHAZARA being fulfilled, is because there is a added dimension of chashash chitui in the instance of CHAZARA, which we don't have in the Isser of Shehiyah. And that was based on what is explained in the Sefer HaYoshar, that since, according to the Shita of Tosfos, the primary presentation of the Isser of CHAZARA is where the CHAZARA is being done on Erev Shabbos, Samuch al Chashecha. You'll recall the Lashon of Tosfos on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis in the Maramakaimos booklet, and Rabbi say in this limud we'll be following a lot inside the booklet. So if I could be Mashiach the Olam to follow the Maramakaimos as we proceed through the Sefer of Maramakaimos. On page 1 of the Maramakaimos, Tosfos the Mamaschil U Beis Hillel. Tosfos' lashon was mashma the ikir plugta have b'choil. The ikir chiddush of the din or the chumrah of CHAZARA is addressing a case where the kedera is returned to the kira still on Erev Shabbos, but too close to Erev Shabbos for the kira to be roiseach before Shabbos comes. And therefore, says the Sefer HaYoshar of Rabbeinu Tam, the chumrah of CHAZARA is that since the wish of the person doing the Maaseh CHAZARA is that the kedera should be roiseach, therefore there's an additional chashash chitui that isn't present in the case of Shehiyah. And the way we explained that is that since in the case of Shehiyah the intent is only that the kedera should conclude its bishul, therefore the chashash of chitui only goes so far. Whereas in the case of CHAZARA, where the kedera is tzoinen and the intent is to heat the kedera, therefore there's a greater a possibility to be mechate. And we said that a clear indication that the Shita of Tosfos is that the basis of the Isser of CHAZARA is because of the Chashash of Shem Yechata, similar to Shehiyah, is because, as we learned at Tosfos on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, again on page 2 of the booklet, Tosfos Dibur Hamaskil Mahu Lismoich, where Tosfos compared and drew an analogy between what is allowed by Shehiyah to what's allowed by CHAZARA. Now, if Tosfos is comparing what is mutter by Shehiyah to be matir, what the cases of CHAZARA, clearly Tosfos understands apipashtos that the geder of these two isurim are the same, and the geder is that both of them are because of the chashash of Shem Yechata. This is what Rabbi Simcha derives from the Sefer HaYoshar of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, the kushya atzuma on this mehalach of Rabbi Simcha is that bishloima on Erev Shabbos or on Shabbos, where the issue is, can one be machzir? Can one place a kedera on a kira that's not goraf and cotton? So even though in an instance of mitztamik viraloi or kemacho ben drusoi, according to Chananya, Shehiyah would be mutter, says Rabbi Simcha, based on Sefer HaYoshar Rabbeinu Tam, CHAZARA would be also because you have a chashash of Shem Yechata. But we learned that it's mefurish in the Gemara that CHAZARA is osir even in the case of mitztamik viraloi, or even according to Chananya in the case of mevushal kamacha ben risoi, even when the kira is garaf and kotum. So where's the chashash chitui in the case of a kedera, a kira being already garaf and kotum? This is the kasha with which, to those who participated in last week's limud, we ended last week's limud with. We began in last week's limud to suggest a fundamental approach to this shaila, which will, Be'ezer Hashem, change and deepen our understanding of the sugya. But we'll begin this week's limud by showing that this question is actually asked by the Taz on page 53 of the booklet's pages. The Taz is in Sifkotin Yud Gimel, the wider part of the Taz, left-hand side of the page, 4 lines from the end of the paragraph. V'ikal meidak. The Taz asks a question. V'ikal meidak. Lomo osru lehachzir begoruf. Why did Chazal make a gzeira and aser chazara even if the kira is goruf? Im hiniach al gabe kira v'kedera v'kayotze boy. Do hokvar nisbashal kol tzarkoi. There's no issue of isabishal. V'horan kosav, as we learned in last week's limud from the Ramban and other Rishonim, afilu mitztamik v'raloi oser b'chazara. Frek the Taz v'ho'ein kan shum chashash, do ho'ein shayach bishal achazeh, v'gam leka l'meicha shem yechate kiven she'ein shom yicholim. So the Taz is asking this basic question. If we understand that the way Rameh Simcha explained based on Sefer Yosher Rabbeinu Tam, that the reason why Chazara is more chomer than Shehiyah is because the person is focused on the rapid heating of the Kedera. Unlike Shehiyah, where it's slow bishul and the Kedera is already heated, and therefore there isn't a chashash chitui. So granted, says the Taz, that there's a greater mokum for chashash chitui in the instance of Chazara than in the instance of Shehiyah. But Soif Kol Soif, that would only explain why Chazara is more chomer to require Goruf and Kotum in instances where Shehiyah wouldn't require Goruf and Kotum. For example, Mitztamik Viraloi or Machal Ben Drusoy according to Chananya. But Rabbi Isa, you'll recall that the fundamental Yesod of Shehiyah begins one step earlier. As we emphasized, that the basis of the Sugi of Chazara is that on Shabbos there's an Isser of Shehiyah Lechatchila. And one can't place a Kedera initially al Gabi Kira b'Shabbos, which is the precursor to the Isser of Chazara. Chazara means returning it. But to place it Lechatchila, Avadaloi hitiru ele Chazara v'loi Shehiyah Lechatchila. We'll see Be'ez Hashem the Lashon of the Ramah as we go forward. If so, Frek the Taz, what's the problem in placing the Kedera al Gabi Kira b'Shabbos? The Kira is Gorah from Kotum. So the Taz answers, and he says, in the Ran, I saw an answer to this question. Now, the Ran doesn't directly address this question. The Ran is addressing a different question. Page 13 of the Mara Makomis. Let's be ma'ayin Be'ez Hashem in the Ran inside. The Ran is on the right-hand column, Dibra Maschel Loi Shon. And the Ran is discussing why, in the case of Chazara, do we find that even a tavshel that's mitztamik v'raloi is also b'Chazara? Zok the Ran. The afal gav the kol hani mile midrabanon dalmoninhu. The sugi of Chazara is only addressing Chumas Dirabanon. The Kaman the Nisbashal Kamacho Ben Drusoi, the Ran sheet is that once it's Mavushal Kamanjah, less be Mishum Mavashal Deraisa. Says the Ran, Hichmiruz al Bidvarim Halolu, Mipneshem Kroivim Lovoi Lidei Isatayra. There's a chashash of Yovoi Lidei Isatayra. We'll return later to try and explain this Ran more in detail. So Zok the Taz, the same way as the Ran, explains that there is a greater mokum chashash in Chazara because Shema Yovei Lidei Isatayra, and that explains why Chazara is more chomer than Shehiyah. In the case of Mitztamik Viraloi, says the Taz, that's the answer to the chashash of Chitu, even in an instance of Gorah from Kotum. Let's explain what the Taz means. La'olam, says the Taz, it's true, there's no chashash really of Chitu once the Kira is Gorah from Kotum. But if we allow Chazara on a Kira that's not Gorah from Kotum, it's korov to be over an Issa Deraisa to return a Kedera in other cases where there'll be an issue of an Issa Deraisa. And therefore, whenever one is placing a Kedera al Gabi Kira b'Shabbos, which is similar to a Ma'isa Bishul, Chachamim will always mach. That's a teretz of the Taz. We'll see the Lashon inside briefly. He says, "Uboran reisi tiritz al zeh shekosav the afagav the kolhanim milim midrabanon ba'almaninhu the kolshin is bashal kamacho ben drusoy less be'mishum bashal deraisa ichmiru b'dvarim halolu b'hem shem kroivim lovadi the isa Torah ad kan l'shayna."
Now there's a new gezerah was created.
Correct, and the chaymer for that is because placing a kedera al gabi kira b'Shabbos is an act in certain cases where that very same act would be an act of bishul deraisa if it wouldn't be mavushal kol tzarkoi. So Chachamim placed a greater level of chumrah on ever placing a keder al gabi kira b'Shabbos. That's a tazis teretz. That's a tazis teretz to the shayla. Now, we find that the Rishonim themselves address this question of the taz, and what we'll endeavor to show in the Rishonim is that even the Fishitas HaTosfos, there are two parts of the Gezerah of Chazara. Rabbeinu Tam is addressing one aspect of the Gezerah of Chazara whose rationale is Chashash Shema Yechata, but there is also an instance of the Gezerah of Chazara where the rationale is Mechse Kimavashal. And we'll have to define in which instance each one applies, the differences between them, but first we'll show where the Makor is for this Chiddush Nifla. Page 11 in the Maramachaimis. In the Moir HaKoton, the Bala Moir, white hand column, Dibur HaMaskil v'chein im goraf kol hagichon. Says the Bala Moir, when he comes to explain the Mishnah, why does Goruf and Kotum allow Chazara? We saw in the Gemara and Daf Lamed Zayin that the basic condition allowing Chazara b'Shabbos is, in a case, requires Goruf and Kotum. Zok the Bala Moir. We're discussing the heter of Chazara after Goruf and Kotum. Zok the Bala Moir. How does Goruf and Kotum enable Chazara? Zok the Bala Moir simple. To holeka lemechash lechituye v'gecholim. Seemingly the Bala Moir is saying, and Rameh Simcha himself says mufurish in his introduction that the Bala Moir ascribes to Shitas HaTosfos that the basis of the Gezerah of Chazara is the Chashash of Shema Yechata. Memela is not the Bala Moir. Once it's Goruf and Kotum, there's no Chashash of Chazara. So now the question begs the Taz. If there's no Chashash Chazara, so what's the Isser of being Machzir al Gabi Akira? That's Goruf and Kotum b'Shabbos. Let's see the next paragraph, top of the left-hand column. Dibur HaMaskil v'dinei Chazara satabsha. So the Bala Moir is now summarizing the halachas of Chazara. Zok the Bala Moir. Mefurish b'Gemara, we know from the Gemara, Shemuter, one can put a kedera back on the kira on Shabbos if you fulfill conditions. But oidam b'yodoi, he hasn't put it down. V'minicham al gabi karka oser. Zot the Bala Moir, why? Mishum denire kemevashe lechatchila b'Shabbos. So advarim eino muvanim. How do we understand that? In the previous paragraph, the Bala Moir had said that the issue that Chazara necessitates Goruf and Kotum is because the issue of Chazara is Chayshin on Shema Yechate. And now the Bala Moir is saying that if you don't fulfill the conditions of Chazara, what's the Isser? Mechse Kimavashal b'Shabbos. So how are the two things consistent? Rabbi said we have a stirum in Eubei in the Bala Moir. Rameh Simcha explained to us that the sugya divides into two entirely different reasons and rationales for the Gezerah of Chazara. He says on the one hand we have Tosfos and the Bala Moir Shema Yechate, and on the other hand we have Rishonim who say Mechse Kimavashal. We'll see those Rishonim Be'ez Hashem. In the Bala Moir that the Rameh Simcha himself is quoting, we see both. When explaining why we need Goruf and Kotum, the Bala Moir says Shema Yechate. And when it comes to fulfilling the conditions of Chazara on Shabbos, otherwise Chazara would be also. He says, because if you don't have the conditions of Chazara, it's Mechse Kimavashal. So Rabbi said, which one is it? What's Mukhrach and Mavur in the Bala Moir, it would seem, is that both reasons are true. And the way that divides up is as follows. If we're coming to explain why we need Goruf and Kotum, even though it's Macho ben Drusoi, or Mavushal called Sarkoi, or even Mitztamek Viraloi, like we just saw from the Ran, why do we need Goruf and Kotum? That's because of the Chashash of Shema Yechata. And why do we have an increased Chashash of Shema Yechata? More chomer than Shia, like the Sefer Yosher explained, because the Kedera is cold, and therefore we're choishish that you want to heat it up rapidly. But now Zot the Bala Moir, I have the Tazis Kasha. The kira is Goruf Kotum, and it's Mavushal called Sarkoi, or Kamacho ben Drusoi, or even Mitztamik Viraloi. What does the Gemara say? No, Chazara is only mutter if you meet certain conditions. Oida biyodoi, etc., etc. Why? Put it on the kedera. What's on the kira? What's the problem? What's the isser here? Exactly the Taz's shaila. If you want to know, is there a chashash chitui? It's gara for kotum. If you want to know, is there a chashash mevashal? It's even mitstamek v'raloi. Zot the balamor al korchoch. Even after gara from kotum, there's an additional chashash. And what's that chashash? That if you put it lechatchila on the kira b'Shabbos, the issue is mechsek mevashal. So Rabbi said we've gained from l'shoynoi shel balamor a yisoid nifla. That whereas the Taz says that this is a shvera shayla, and his answer is that the reason why, despite Goraf and Kotum, it's also to put something on a kira b'Shabbos is because it's a chumrah, because Shema Yovel de Issa de Raisa, the Balamor b'Tich Dvar was being the Gal of the Teretz. They're two distinct gezeres. Now, if you'll ask, we've learned the sugyas, we've been ma'ayin in the Gemara, where these two dinim of CHAZARA, where's the makar for the sugya? Where are these two dinim? We have one Mishnah that says not al machzir or not al eine machzir. Where do we have a makar for two dinim? We're suggesting Rabbi Said, again, let's go back to the Lashon of Balamor. Initially, top of the right-hand column, he says the reason why we need Goraf and Kotum is because a chashash of Shema Yechate. The reason why on Shabbos you can only put something back on the Kedera is because otherwise it's mechsek in mevashel. There's only one gezeira of CHAZARA. How do we know both? Where's the makar of these two gezeiras?
In other words, how do we know to divide it up chronologically? The Erev Shabbos could be a disser
of without Garf and Kotum, and on Shabbos itself, the Isser is Shemachsek and Mevashel. Where are the makar for these two sugyas? The answer is Rabbi said the Balamor himself tells us the teretz. It's very simple. We have one Mishnah on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis that says that Notal Yachzir. That there's a din of putting or removing a K'deira Erev Shabbos. On that, the Gemara says, in order to be able to put something back Shabbos, you need Garf and Kotum. So the Balamor, why should you need Garf and Kotum? Al Korchoch says the Balamor, the Gemara has a Gezeira of Shema Yechata. Now we have another sugya. We have a sugya in Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis that discusses the conditions necessary for CHAZARA. Has to be biyodoi, lo hinichal gabi karka. What's that Gemara based on? The Kira is already Gara for Kotum. We know that from the Mishnah. Al Korchoch in that Gemara, in that Memra of the Amoyroim that we require to know CHAZARA, it's Mavur that there's a separate Gzeira. So the Balamor, we have two sugyas. The Mishnah that requires Gara from Kotum is Chashash Chitui. And the Sugya of Lamed Ches that requires Tnoi CHAZARA, despite the fact that it's Gara from Kotum, must be addressing of Chashash, of Mechsekim Mevashel. So Zot the Balamor, we have two Sugyas Mufuroshois. We have one Gemara that is on Daf Lamed Zayin that discusses the mission that says without Gara from Kotum, CHAZARA is never possible, even if it's Mufashal Kol Tzarke, Umit Samek Virali, Umacho Ben Drusoy, no Heterim of Shehir. Why? Chashash Shem Yechata, like the Sefer Yosha says, because since the Kedera is cold, you're intent on being Mechamim it. But then we have another Sugya. The Kira is already Gara from Kotum, and we still need conditions of CHAZARA. Why? Put it there in the first place. Take it cold and put it on top of the Kira. What's the chashash? Shem Yechate, it's Gara for Kotum. Zot the Balamor al Kochel, there's a new chashash of Mechsekim Mevashel. So that we just saw a Taz that had a very good explanation of it.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question that is asking is that this question is so mukhrach that despite that, how can there be an Isser of CHAZARA Shabbos if the Kira is already Gara from Kotum and there's no Chashash of Shem Yechate? It must be that there's a new Gezeira of Mechsekim Mevashel. The Taz had an answer to the question. He said, CHAZARA were machmer even though it doesn't seem to fit with any Gedarim. Yeah, you're being niskash in the Taz. What's our nicer does? It has to have some type of gather. So we see, the Rishonim explained that alcohol there two dinim. Now Rabbi said, to be madgish the Chiddush, if one's ma'ayin in the Gedolei Achronim, and we'll see them momentarily in Shulchan Aruch HaRav, in Eglei Tal, Tila L'David, others, they divide the Rishonim, as Ramei Simcha does, into two worlds. There's the Rishonim that hold of Chashash Chitui, and the Rishonim that hold of Mechsekim Mevashel. And these are two distinct and separate approaches that the Rishonim take. What we've showed is that Balamor already has required the combination of both. Now, in Shitas HaTosfos, Rameh Simcha told us, based on the Sefer HaYosha, Tosfos only ever mentions a Chashash Shema Yechate. What does Tosfos hold about this question? What is it that asas Chazara b'Shabbos or Shehiyah L'Chatchila b'Shabbos? So the Taz says the answer is Chumrah. I didn't put this in the microphone. I was preparing the Shir B'Siyata B'Shmaya. I came across Be'ezer Hashem a Tosfos Rosh, where the Tosfos Rosh says Mufurish in Shitas HaTosfos that Tosfos also has the Chashash of Mechsek Mevashel for Chazara on Shabbos. I'll just read out briefly the Lashon of the Tosfos Rosh that's relevant. It's a Tosfos Rosh on Daf Lamed Ches on the Beis. The first Tosfos Rosh on Daf Lamed Ches on the Beis. The Tosfos Rosh is discussing the reason, the rationale behind the Shitas HaTosfos, why we need the conditions for Chazara, why it has to be Oida B'Yodai, not Hinicha Gabi Karka, etc. Zok there because Nistalko Shehiyah Rishoyna, says the Tosfos Rosh. I apologize if I say it's not in the Marmakonis booklet. He says Nistalko Shehiyah Rishoyna v'havei k'moi Shehiyah Chadosha uboshil b'Shabbos. Lashon of the Tosfos Rosh. Boshil b'Shabbos. Now correct. Rashi says Hatmana, but here without Hatmana we have Boshil b'Shabbos. The Rishonim pe'echad argue with Rashi, like we discussed in Limud, and Yeshikach for bringing that
up. And the Rashba also similar languages in the Rashba.
Now, but the Rashba, Reb Shlomo, we can't bring a proof from, because Rabbi Seina Achronim told us that the Rashba, like the Ran, has Chazara as being entirely because of Mechsekim Mevashel. The chiddush that we've discovered is that Rameh Simcha tells us that Shitas HaTosfos and the Balamor is on one side of the discussion. They are Rishonim that ascribe to the Shema Yechata Svara. And on the other hand, we have the Ran and the Rashba who discuss Mechsekim Mevashel. Here we have a Tosfos Rosh that says Mefurish, exactly what we found in the Balamor. That Tosfos asas Chazara Erev Shabbos because of Chashash Shema Yechata. But the Tosfos Rosh explains the basis for the reason why one can't place a kira on a kedera on a kira l'chatchila b'Shabbos is why? The Tosfos Rosh, because it's a shia chadasha u'boshil b'Shabbos. So we have mefurish be'ezer Hashem even in Shitas HaTosfos. That la'olam Shitas HaTosfos also we need to combine both the chashash of Shema Yechate and the chashash of Mechsekim Mevashel. And the distinction between the two is which scenario we're addressing. If we're addressing a scenario where the kira is not yet gora for kotum, so there you say the reason why Chazara doesn't have the kulas of Shehiyah is because there's an enhanced, we'll call it Chashash or Shema Yechate in the case of Chazara. Then we have a separate nidan. Then we have a discussion. Now, given that the kira is gora for kotum, asks the Taz, so what's the chashash? It's gora for kotum. Here the Rishonim say, because to place it l'chatchila b'Shabbos is mechsekim mevashel. Mavur in the Balamor, and now Mavur be'ezer Hashem in the Tosfos Rosh b'Shitas HaTosfos. So what we're explaining is, now we're going to get to see if we still have two camps. So the Rameh Simcha put in the Chashash Shema Yechata camp, he put Tosfos and the Balamor. The Balamor was showing has both, and Tosfos was showing the Tosfos Rosh has both. And Be'ez Hashem will now try and show in the Mechsekim Mevashel camp, does the Mechsekim Mevashel camp rely entirely on Mechsekim Mevashel, or do they also incorporate some degree of Chashash Shema Yechata? And that will be the next part of the Limud Be'ez Hashem. So we know, as Shlomo pointed out before, and as was just asked, that the Ran's Shita is that the Ran ascribes to the Svara that the reason why Chazara is Osir is because of the Chashash of Mechsekim Mevashel. That's Rameh Simcha was Mashrish, that there's to use your Lashon, there's the Ran camp, the Rashba camp, who clearly explain the rationale for the Isser of Chazara as Mechsekim Mevashel. Now, let's ask the following Shaila. We know that Shitas HaTosfos Tosfos was Mechadish. And Rabbi said again, to recall the Lashon we began the Limud with, Tosfos calls that the Iker Shaila of Chazara in the Mishnah is Chazara be'erev Shabbos. Too close to Shabbos for the Kedera to boil up. That is the classic presentation, says Tosfos, of Chazara in the Mishnah. Now, we would expect that if the Ran were to discuss if there is such an Isser of Chazara of Erev Shabbos, what would the Ran say? Impossible. How could there be an Isser of Chazara Erev Shabbos? On Erev Shabbos is a Mechsek in the Vashel? How could that be? We're talking about putting it on B'chol. The whole issue of Chazara is, by definition, putting it back or on in the first place, B'Shabbos. But Erev Shabbos? How could that be? Rameh Simcha told us the only reason why Taisus can ever discuss and consider that there should be an Issa Chazara Erev Shabbos is only because of the Chashash of Shema Yechata. It's more, but the Ram, should say that there should be no Issa Erev Shabbos. Let's see the Ram on page 8 of the Maramakanis. It's on the right-hand side, Dibra Mascha, the Kosua Taisus, right-hand column of Rabbeinu Nisim, the Kosua Taisus. The Ran quotes the entire Taisus. And he says, Taisus is mechadish that there's an Isser of Shehiyah Erev Shabbos. The Kosua Taisus, the Midibei Shammai, Osri Kai Gavna Filo Begrufa, Nishma Lebesil Be'enu Grufa, the Koshu Somach Lechashecha Kol Kach Osa. Zot the Ran veloy nearly came. I don't agree with that. He says, no, the reason why Beis Shammai don't allow you to be machzir is not because there's an Issa Chazar Erev Shabbos. It's because it's Beis Shammai l'shitosoi that you can't begin a Malacha Erev Shabbos that will end on Shabbos. That's the unique shita of Beis Shammai. And he's marich to prove that. Discusses, yes, not, back and forth. If he agrees or doesn't agree to Taisus. Rabbi say, if the Ran would only have Mechsei Kimevashal, it's not shaykh, the whole din. The Ran should say to Taisus, how is it ever possible to have a Gezerah of Chazara Erev Shabbos? How are you talking? The Ran doesn't say that. The Ran says, no, I have another way of explaining Beis Shammai. You're bringing a proof, he says to Taisus, that the mashmos of the Mishnah is that there's an Issa Chazara Erev Shabbos. So the Ran, I can explain it another way. Because there's an Issa, according to Beis Shammai, to start Melacha Erev Shabbos. The Ran should say there's no mokum for the Gezerah of Taisus B'chlal. Can't be. Can't be. Al Korchoch, if the Ran is anticipating and discussing Taisus Chiddush, but Pashtos, it's Mavur in the Ran that the Ran also has. Al Koponim, the Ran considered a Chashash of Shema Yechata. No, but he should be madche that there's no mokum for Taisus B'chlal. The Ran just says, if you want to prove it from Beis Shammai, I have another explanation for Beis Shammai. And therefore, Taisus doesn't have a proof to be mechadish this chumrah of Chazara Erev Shabbos. With the Ran, of course there's no mokum for the chumrah on Erev Shabbos. How could that be? There's no mechzikim mevashal Erev Shabbos. There's no havamina. Rameh Simcha explains the whole basis of Taisus, that there could ever be a chumrah of Chazara Erev Shabbos is only because Taisus has a chashash of Shema Yechata. Like the Sefer Yosha says, you put it so close to Shabbos, you'll be mechata b'Shabbos. But the Ran's mechzikim mevashal means putting the kedera on the kira means that it looks like you're doing a ma'aseh bishul. I'm doing this Erev Shabbos. It could be very close to the zman. It could be very close to the time that there's not enough time for it to become reseach, but it's choil. It's the weekday. It's muvur in the Ran, and we'll go on now to show how if the poskim did or didn't understand the Ran this way, that the Ran also has, or at least considers, the possibility of a Gezerah Shema Yechata. Now, we could be matcha, and we could say that if we look in the Rosh on page 17 of the Maramakamis, left-hand column, towards the end of the first paragraph, last 3 or 4 lines, Zot de Rosh. What is the basis? What's the rationale for the Isser of Chazara Erev Shabbos? Zot de Rosh. He says towards the end of the paragraph on the left-hand side, he says, Kulo Chodo Gezerahi. It's based on the Gezerah of Chazara on Shabbos. Why? The cave on the Eina Mevusheles Oid Alakira, since it can no longer be boiled up because it's too close to Shabbos, have it Tchilas Ashiyah. It's like you're not doing Chazara, but you're doing a Tchilas Ashiyah. If you're allowed to put it on Erev Shabbos, Osi lehachzir mishechashecha. What did the Rosh just say? not because we're choishish that you'll be, not that you'll be choishish that you'll be mechate to speed up the heat Shabbos. But why is it also to be machzer Erev Shabbos? It's also to be machzer Erev Shabbos because we're afraid that we'll become confused and say, well, if you can put a kedera al gabi kira so close to Shabbos that we'll only start cooking on Shabbos, so maybe I could put it there in the first place on Shabbos. Nu svara. So la'olam we could say that whereas until now we've explained Tosfos that the reason why there's a gezerah of being machzer Erev Shabbos, like Rameh Simcha said, is because you'll be choishish, you'll be mechate b'Shabbos to speed up the heating of the tavshil. The Rosh has an entirely different svara. Correct. He says the reason is because we're choishish that you'll be machzer b'Shabbos. Meil it's kulo choda gezerah. So if we learn like that in Shitzat Tosfos, then we lose our proof in the Ran. What did we ask? He said, how can the Ran discuss the question of an Issa Chazara be'erev Shabbos, Teipuklei, that on Erev Shabbos there's no Mechzikim Evashel. So we said al Korchal that the Ran has to also concede of the possibility of a Gzeira Shem Yechate. Lefi the Rosh, there's no Rai. That's one way to dismiss our proof that the Ran also has to agree to the possibility of Shem Yechate. Now we're going to go on to show a Chiddush Nefla. That's mavur in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav in the Kuntras Achron narration of Gimel Sivkot and Ches. And this is not in the Maramakaim's booklet, but this is in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav in the Kuntras Achron.
I think we have it. I think we.
In some narration of Gimel Sivkot and Ches. We had it from the Limud of last week.
Yeah, we got it last night.
The Kuntras Achron, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, seemingly also divides, like Rameh Simcha, the Rishonim into two camps: the Shem Yechate camp and the Mechzikim Evashel camp. So the Shulchan Aruch HaRav discusses what would the Ran hold about Tosfos' din of putting something on the kira somach l'chashecha. So what would we expect the Shulchan Aruch HaRav to say? The Ran shouldn't hold of it because there's no Mechzikim Evashel. He's divided the Rishonim into two camps. Mechzikim Evashel doesn't hold of Shem Yechate. Shem Yechate doesn't have Mechzikim Evashel. Two camps. So the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says that the reason why the Ran allows Chazara Samuch L'Chashecha is, he says, because the Ran anyway has a different shita in Chazara entirely in the sugya. Towards the bottom of the paragraph, he says, "V'su the gam b'Shabbos in matir im silkom mishachashecha v'chein haminig." We'll learn about this as we go through the sugya further. But the Ran's shita is that the Isser of Chazara is only to place it on the kira lechatchila b'Shabbos. But if it was taken off on Shabbos, you can put it back on Shabbos without any conditions of Chazara. So Meil is the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. The Ran never has a problem of putting it on the Kira Erev Shabbos because he holds that the only issue of Mechzikim Evashel is only where it's been put on the first place on the Kira B'Shabbos. What do we see from the Shulchan Aruch HaRav? That means the Shulchan Aruch HaRav considers that according to the Ran, there is a possibility of Mechzikim Evashel even when it's placed on the Kira Erev Shabbos. Let's go over what the Shulchan Aruch HaRav has just said. He said that since the Ran anyway limits the issue of Mechzikim Evashel to where it's put on the kira in the first place on Shabbos, that therefore says that to put it Erev Shabbos on the Chashecha is not an issue of Mechzikim Evashel. How could it be an issue of Mechzikim Evashel? We're talking about putting it on the kira Erev Shabbos. The whole arichas of the Kuntras Achron, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, does Mechzikim Evashel, does the Ran's Gzeira apply Erev Shabbos? Would the Ran not hold of the Gzeira Erev Shabbos? L'may nafkamina. Hare, there's no Mechzikim Evashel Erev Shabbos. Vais the Chois, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, is showing us that we made a wrong assumption in the sugya. And that, of course, there is a possibility of Mechzikim Evashel on Erev Shabbos also. How does that make sense? Hare, at the moment that you're putting it on the kira, it's choil. The answer is, Rabbi Yisai, and the Yisai Dvarim is mavur in the Pnei Yeshua. And we saw the Pnei Yeshua in last week's limud briefly. Mechzikim Evashel doesn't mean necessarily only the moment that the kedera was put on the kira. It doesn't mean that the person watching sees you taking a kedera, something that is a kedera of taking a pot and putting it al gabi kira bishul. That's not what it means. It means whenever the bishul is progressing on Shabbos in a way that ordinarily would have not been possible without the Isser of bishul being over. Meaning, normally the way a kedera is kept warm on Shabbos is based on shihir. When someone walks into the kitchen a few minutes after lichtbenchen and he sees a cold pot of soup on the fire, what does he say? It was just put on. So having a cold tavshil on the kira b'Shabbos is mechsei kimevashal. Not because the moment that it was put on looks like the person's doing a ma'aseh bishul, but the state of a kedera being on the kira in a way that it must have been just now placed creates the issue of mechsei kimevashal. So we ask on the Ran, how can the Ran B'chlal discuss the shayla of the Isser of CHAZARA Erev Shabbos? HaRav, the Ran, according to the Achronim that divide it into two camps, that the Ran never has a chashash of Shema Yechata. So what's the issue of Mechsekim Mevashal Erev Shabbos? Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, of course it's Shaykh Mechsekim Mevashal Erev Shabbos. And the Kuntrach have a long discussion about whether or not the Ran will or won't hold of Teisis Svara. Vice the Chos on the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and the Pnei Yeshua says this Svara. Mechsekim Mevashal doesn't mean the moment it was put on. It means if an observer sees a cold kedera al gabi kira, it looks like a situation of something being nisbashal in the first place on Shabbos. That creates mechsekim mevashal. Correct. So that the svara that we mentioned from the Pnei Yeshua was on Chokes B'Sham V'Sil B'Negeh to Shehiyah. The Ran will hold that if you hold a mechsekim mevashal without the conditions of chazara, then Rechanai V'Sil will be moedeh. Oh, no. So no, correct. So that's a general machlokes all malachas if they're allowed to finish Shabbos. Correct. So Beis Hillel, that's an excellent point. But the answer is Beis Hillel hold that that's not relevant by sham malachas. By bishul we were machmir to be goyzer mechsekim mevashal. Afilu, correct. Afilu Beis Hillel. Why? Because the state of a cold kedera al gabi kira indicates a process of bishul. It's a chiddush nifla that's mavur mitoich divrei Shulchan Aruch HaRav. So the
answer was, why isn't the Talmud Machlekes based on Beis Hillel? And the answer was even the Ram would be machmir even according to Beis Hillel.
Correct. And we have Rabbi said to summarize three possibilities so far in the sheet of the Ram. To recap the Shaila is how can the Ram discuss B'chlal? If there's an Issa Chazara Erev Shabbos, if we divide the Rishonim neatly into two camps that neither hold of the other, there's no Mechsekim Mevashal Erev Shabbos. One answer was that the Ran agrees to the Balamar. There is a possibility of the Gzeir of Shema Yechata if it's not Garif and Kotum. Two, the Rosh, that the reason why it's Osir, Chazara Erev Shabbos, is a Gzeira that you'll be Machzir b'Shabbos. Three, there's a possibility of Mechsekim Mevashal even on Erev Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav. Now,
what about the other Ran, Reish and Gimel, what we spoke about? The Ran, Reish and Gimel, that says that you're allowed to take it even out of the fridge. And that was as long as it was on the fire on Shabbos,
correct.
Put it to the fridge, so you could take it back and put it on. So the Ran says it's no Hazar.
So, because the Ran says that in that case there is no Mechsekim Mevashal because we always associate it back to the cooking, exactly. But where it was from, but he's considering that if it was only placed on the kedera samuch to Erev Shabbos, then maybe we won't be able to associate it back to being on the Eish on Shabbos. It's too soon. That's the answer to the shayla. So before we continue in analyzing the Shittas Rishonim, let's discuss a number of nafkaminas lahalacha. If the issue is Erev Shabbos, the Gezerah is Shema Yechata, like the Balamor and Tosfos and their Sefer Yashar, is the issue like the Rosh because maybe you'll be Machzir b'Shabbos, or is the issue because there's Mechsekim Mevashal on Erev Shabbos? Boy said we have clear nafkaminas. Page 55 in the Maramakoimis, in the Shulchan Aruch's pages, we'll learn Be'ez Hashem a Mogen Avrom. The Mogen Avrom in Sivkoten Chav Zayin says that if we hold like the Rosh, that the Chashash is that you'll come to be Machzir b'Shabbos, he says, V'im eino muvusheles kol tzarkoi. Important chiddush. If the tavshil is not muvushel kol tzarkoi, shori lahachzir somach l'chashecha, you would be allowed to put it back right before, to put it on the Kedera, on the Kira right before Shabbos. Why? We're not going to be goyzer that you're going to do that on Shabbos. The person's never going to put back. He's never going to put l'chatchila on the Kira. A tavshel, it's not mavushal kol tzarkei. Mavushal kol tzarkei is an issa shalav and issa deraisa. From Machal ben Drusoi to mavushal kol tzarkei. So the Mogen Avram has told us a kula that according to the Rosh, if on page 55, right hand column, the Dibram and Sifkot Nuchav Zayin in the Mogen Avram, he says, why? Because you're not going to do that on Shabbos. Why are you not going to do that on Shabbos? Because there's an Isser of Bishul. It's not an Isser of Bishul. So therefore, we're not goyzer that you'll repeat this same action Shabbos. The whole gezerah is maybe you'll be machzir b'Shabbos. That's only that you're going to be makel to do a wrong chazara. But bishul deraisa, who's ever going to do a bishul deraisa?
So it comes out a big paradox. We're not geyser, you're going to do a bishul deraisa. We'll geyser that somebody else will see and he'll do a bishul deraisa.
So we'll get to that Beis Hashem.
How does that make sense?
How does that make sense? We'll get to that Beis Hashem. But Rabbi said, let's point out one nakuda, just agav, mishum chavivus of the kasha, since we've been oisik in the sugyas of shehir. Frek the menorah tahira. Chitui deraisa he's going to do? I don't understand. The whole gezerah of shehiyah is based on the fact that he's going to be mechata deraisa, which is havara deraisa. So how can the Mogen Avram say that tavshel, that's not mavushal kol tzarkei, he's not going to be machzir because it's not mavushal kol tzarkei. He won't be over an issa deraisa. And the whole chashash chitui? Tell her, we'll leave the shaila on the side for the moment. Zok the Mogen Avram, if the chashash would be a chashash of just that he'll be machzir b'Shabbos, so the he'll never do that on the tavshel of mavushal kol tzarkei because of issa b'shul deraisa. But Rabbi said, let's think for a moment. If the chashash would be a chashash chitui, would something not mavushal kol tzarkei be a matter? According to the Sefer HaYoshar, and according to Ramei Simcha and Shitas HaTosfos, that the chashash is that whenever something is placed cold on a kira, we're choishish that he's going to be mechata to speed up the bishul. Does it matter whether or not it's mavushal kol tzarkei or not mavushal kol tzarkei? That whole kula doesn't apply. If we learn the chashash is Rabbi Yisai that he'll be machzir this b'Shabbos, we'll say this will never be machzir b'Shabbos because there's an issa deraisa involved with bishul. But at chashash meichata, it's the same thing. My nafkimin if it's chatzi mavushal kula mavushal gabi shem meichata elamai mevur that the Mogen Avram says that we could use the rosh kula. And the ikar reason why it's also to be machzir erev Shabbos is that's the chashash meichzir b'Shabbos, not because of shem meichata. Because if the chashash should be shem meichata, it makes no difference if it's mavushal kol tzarkei or it's mavushal chatzi bishul. If we learn the gezerah is that this very same tavshel, he'll be machzir b'Shabbos, so it's called the Mogen Avram, this tavshel he won't put back because there's an issa deraisa to put it back. But l'gabi chitui, it's the same thing. Al karchoch, that's one nafkimina that lefi the Mogen Avram. Could we be maker on a tavshel that's only mavushal chatzi bishul? Could we be machzir samach l'chashecha?
Why don't we worry about the Bashir? Why don't we say the same thing? Make him put on Shabbos.
Why?
Bashir, before we have
Right.
How are you not to put somebody should be mashal on the roof?
The Torah says every shehiyah means where there's man for it to be reiseach before Shabbos, and therefore it's not samach enough. You're right. That's the difference between chazara b'erev Shabbos and shehiyah. Your question is Tosfos' question, and Tosfos says, "What's the difference in shehiyah and chazara?" So Tosfos says it depends how long it is before Shabbos and chanami. Abai say another zisa nafkimina. To go back to shehiyah sugyas for a moment. We said that the Shulchan Aruch HaRav in Kuntra Sachin is mechadish that there's mechse kimevashel even on Erev Shabbos. Frektach the Shaila Rabbi say, what about Kidro Chaisa? Rabbi saying, Auto Yedid Unzera from the Sugya of Shehiyah, we have a din of Kidro Chaisa. You take something that's completely not cooked, you could be mashit right close to chashecha. And other Rabbi Yisrael will recall it has to be close to chashecha because if it's already cooked a little bit, shein ois kidra chaisa. How could you do that? It's chazara. Chazara samach l'chashecha. Every kidra chaisa that has to be not yet mavushal b'tchilas haShabbos, so it's been put so close to Shabbos that how is that mutter?
There's no chazara there. It's on the Eish.
But when did you put it on? You put it on the H, not Samach L'Shabbos. You put in a Garma. So if you'll say that you didn't, because so correct. So the Rosh, if the Chashash Hashem Yivashal, it will be mutter. Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. Here's the nafkamina. If the Isser of Chazara, like what you're saying, Erev Shabbos, is only because of either Shema Yechate or because of Mevashal, so it's mutter. Why? Chashash Chitui you don't have by Kidra Chaisa, and Shema Yevashal, we have the Magen Avraham. But if you go out Mechsek in Mevashal, so Memela Kidra Chaisa is also. If it's so Samach L'Chashecha that it won't be able to be Resech. What will the only eitzah be? The only eitzah will be to add the Kidra Chaisa to an existing state of Shia. The Kitzer Rabbi said the Shaila is a Kidra Chaisa, placing a Kidra Chaisa L'Chatchil on the Eish, Samach L'Shabbos mutter. Take a raw steak and put it in a pot on the Kedera Erev Shabbos.
Put the steak in the pot and then put the pot on the fire.
So
that's why it's supposed to throwing the meat into the pot.
So Zot the Kuntres Achron, if there is Shaykh a Mechsek Mevashal on Erev Shabbos, then the Kidra Chaisa should be also. He says this will be the nafkamina Zot the Kuntres Achron between the two camps. If it's Shema Yechate, to use the lashon that we used before, the Shema Yechate camp, there's no Chashash Uchita by Kidra Chaisa. If it's because of Mechsek Mevashal, it's Shaykh Mechsek Mevashal, even by a Kidra Chaisa. Let's see the lashon of the Kuntres Achron, if you may, in Sivkot and Ches. He says, Midivrei Taz Mavur, from the Taz we see that the Isser of Chazara is because of Chitur. The Efshadam Magen Avraham Svirli Nami Hochi. Ula Hochi Hitir B'chai. That's why the Magen Avraham allows you to put in a Dover Chai Erev Shabbos. Aval Lefi Ma Shekosavnu Bifnim B'Shem Haran, the Ran camp. V'atam Mishum de Mechsei Kimevashal Lechatchila Ein LaHokel B'Chai Samach L'Chashecha Nifla. There's a Mechsei Kimevashal on Erev Shabbos, and therefore you can't put in a Dover Chai Samach L'Chashecha. Rabbi said Veltz Nafkamina between, to use the lashon, the two camps. In the Shema Yechate camp, so a Dover Chai takes care of Shema Yechate. But if we're in the Mechsei Kimevashal camp, Zot the Kuntres Achron, that should ask placing it on the Kedei or even Erev Shabbos. Erev Shabbos Mechsei Kimevashal, that's a Chiddush of HaRav. But the nafkamina would be, could you put in a Dover Chai? So this brings us to that. To this concludes this step. The Gemara is only saying it to the dinim of shihia, that if it was placed long enough before, then shihia is mutter b'de Kidra Chaisa. But here we're speaking about, could you put it on the Kedei mamash Samach L'Chashecha? Do we have an additional chumrah of chazara? The case that you're asking is, could we put it so long before Shabbos, where ordinarily we would need garaf and katan, because it's not yet milshot machap and shut. Kidra Chaisa says we don't need garaf and katan, but that's as long as we're only in a shehiyah situation. But what happens if we're so close to chashecha that it doesn't have time to be martiach? So the Shulchan Aruch HaRav Mechsek Mevashal will apply. Hello.
Let me just one little bone, so the person's going to say that everything is cooked for one little bone, and so they'll say everything else is cooked, so they won't think that there's additional. Just one little bone get lost in the big pot.
You're asking in the gather of Kidra Chaisa B'chlal, why is this das? Right. So that's really a technical shaila b'negeh to Kidra Chaisa, and with the permission, I'll leave the shaila to the end. That's not directly relevant to this particular application of Kidra Chaisa. That's an issue by Shihir also, as was pointed out before. That din is true, and we'll deal with.
No, we have to go. It's a separate Kidra Chaisa shaila.
Right. It's a Kidra Chaisa, which B'lineda will deal with it at the end of the limud. So to this point, Rabbi said we've established that there are achronim, for example, the Kuntres Achron of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, who have established what we call two camps. That the Isser of Chazara Erev Shabbos is the same as the Isser Chazara Shabbos at Mechsek Mevashal, and we're suggesting that the Rishonim that combine both, Shitza Tesus, Shitza Balamor. And we're suggesting possibly that the Ran also may combine both, unless we say that the Ran holds like the Rosh, that the Isser of Chazara is because of Shema Yatzek B'Shabbos, or we have the Chiddush of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, that there's Mechsek Mevashal even on Erev Shabbos. Now, we will recall that we saw briefly at the beginning of this limud, and we focused on this very much in last week's limud for those that participated, on a Tosfos on Daf, Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. In the Maramakomis. This is on page 2. So the way it's printed, the Tosfos is on the inner margin. Dibra Maschem Ma'u Lismoich. Just to recap again the Chiddush of Tosfos, that Tosfos compared the dinim of Shehiyah to the dinim of Chazara. And Tosfos says if smicha, which means placing it not on the kira but next to the kira, is mutter for Shehiyah, is also mutter for Chazara. How could Tosfos compare the two? Shehiyah is Shema Yechata. Chazara, Ichmiru boy. Or we would say, the Chiddushei Haran l'shitosai, that is because he machzik him mevashel. How can Tosfos compare a kula that applies to Shehiyah to a kula that applies to Chazara? So from there, we initially try to prove, Remei Simcha Svara, that Tosfos must hold that the only Isser of Chazara is Shema Yechata, 2 camps. The Ran is in his camp that only has Mechzik and Mevashel. Tosfos is in his camp that he only has Shema Yechata, and the Isser Shehiyah is Shema Yechata. But Rabbi Say, we saw now that the Shita, that the Tosfos Rosh says, B'Shitas HaTosfos, that Tosfos also holds of Mechzik and Mevashel b'Shabbos. That explains the Tanoim of Chazara. We saw that in the Balamor. We saw that in Kamar Rishonim. We possibly even hold that the Ran himself holds that the two are doing. So how then can we compare Shehiyah and Chazara? How could the two be comparable? Tosfos says in the same way as smicha is mutter for Shehiyah, meaning I'm not putting on top of the kira, I'm putting it away from the kira with a mechitza that divides the two. So therefore the same thing should be mutter in the case of Chazara. Like Harvu Zelzeh. So in order to be able to answer this question, we would have to suggest one of two things. Sorry, did I put something up? That's good. Oh, I'm sorry. We would have to suggest one of two things. Either that the same way as smicha says that if it's not on the kira, there's no chashash chitui. It's as though the tavshil is away from the kira. So therefore, we can't either consider the possibility of mechzik mevashel, because mechzik mevashel is in the usual format of a kira being on a kedera and a kira. So by the same reasoning that there's no chashash shema yechata, because we don't see the kedera as being related to the kira at all, because there's a mechitza beineim, so therefore we don't have mechzik mevashel either. That will be one way of explaining how the Rishonim draw parallel between the two. The other way to explain it is not to say that smicha breaks the relationship between the kedera and the kira, but to say something a little more yesodistic, which actually has a makar in the Rosh, and we'll learn this Rosh Be'ez Hashem in a further limud b'nei, and that's like this. The heter for smicha is not that. Depends how close proximity there is, or how much distance there is, or how much mechitza there is between the kedera and the kira. That's not the logic of the kula of smicha. The logic of the kula of smicha is that smicha is not considered an act of bishul. It's called smicha. It's warming. It's not cooking. When is it that a person puts something close to the kira, and when is it that he puts it on the kira? What's the difference between the two? When he puts it close to the kira, he wants to warm it. When he puts it on the kira, he wants to cook. That's the difference between the two. So therefore, in the case of smicha, the reason why smicha is mutter by shehiyah is because the person is not involved in cooking. He's just warming. And on warming, we never created the chashash of all the gezeres of peret kira. There's a chiddush that smicha is excluded from any of the gezeres that apply in peret kira.
Could become a Yatzaledis dog?
Could be Yatzaledis, but it's a bishul doiraisa issue, but it's not Shehiyah and Chazar. We're talking about the gezeres of peret kira. To heat something, you can't heat something in Toldos or either. You can't use radiant heat to cook either. Right?
So what was the word shayla maya lismor?
Oh, so the Gemara shayla of Ma'u Lismoich was exactly the shayla. And thank you for bringing up asking that. The shayla of Ma'u Lismoich is smicha considered an act of bishul or is smicha an entirely different category of maisa, which is just warming? That's the shayla. Zok the Gemara, if smicha is mutter, says say the Rishonim, the reason why smicha is mutter, it's warming, it's not bishul. Chachamim never created gzeiros on something that doesn't have the characteristics of a maisa bishul. Smicha is mutter. So therefore, returning now to the shit of Tosfos, Tosfos isn't saying that because shehiyah is mutter, chazara is mutter. Of course, there's no comparison between the two. But the reason why shehiyah is mutter is because it can't be considered an act of bishul. And therefore, Tosfos says, if it's not considered a ma'aseh bishul at all, it's considered a ma'aseh smicha, so therefore there's no gezerah whatsoever. And Be'ez Hashem, as I mentioned, bli neder, in a further limud, perhaps even next week, we will learn a rosh later in Perek Kiran, in Siman Yud, after the sugyas, where the rosh will be mavur b'seich dvarav. This chidush, that smicha is mutter, not because smicha technically takes care of the chashash, but because smicha isn't equivalent, and therefore isn't included in any of the gezerahs of Perek Kira. So we'll conclude b'li neder this chelik of the chelik halacha of this limud with the following question: if we assume, like the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and those achreinim, of the two camps svara, or the two camps mahalach in the sugya, Tosfos has Shem Yechata and doesn't acknowledge Mechzik Mevashel. The Ran has Mechzik Mevashel and doesn't acknowledge the Chashash of Chitui. So, the Eglei Tal, why didn't Tosfos agree to the din of the Ran of Mechzik Mevashel? Tosfos seems to be very forced. Why? Tosfos has a svara, has been mamtzi a svara of Chashash Chitui. And in order to be able to say that Chashash of Chitui, Tosfos has to say the chashash of chitui of shehiyah is different to the chashash of chitui of CHAZARA. Like the Sefer Yosha says, one is a kedera that's hot and one is a kedera that's cold. Why so forced? Why couldn't Tosfos simply say that CHAZARA is completely distinct from shehiyah and is a new gezerah of the chashash of mechzik mevashel? Why the necessity to yet somehow force the chashash of Shema Yechata in a way that's different to shehiyah? What's being machriach Tosfos? So Rabbi say again, the Chavivas Indian, to mention the Akush Nifla of the Avnei Nezer. I once saw the recollections of Reb Godel Eisner, who was a mashpia in Yeshivas Hasemes in Eretz Yisrael and was of the Gedolei Hasidim in Lodz. And he said before the war, Gerach Hasidim used to come to the Beis Medrash in the night to learn through a Geshmakish Tikal Eglei Tal. It was a sefer that they tzadked with. It was a sefer nifla, goyness of the Avnei Nezer. Zok the Avnei Nezer. The reason why Tosfos argued is because Tosfos was bothered by a kushya atzuma. If we follow the Ran Svaras, that the issue is a mechzik mevashel issue. So Rabbi say, how does Gora from Kotum take care of that? How does Gora from Kotum take care of mechzik mevashel? He's taking a kedera and putting it on a boiling kira b'Shabbos. So he says, Bishleim a goruf. So we could possibly say, since you've taken out the gecholim, especially according to those Rishonim, that you have to remove all of them, that will take away mechzik mevashel. But Kotum is Kotum koldu. It means you just sprinkle some choil on the gecholim. There's no mechzik mevashel. Kedera is boiling hot. The imtim tzaloima says the Avnei Nezer that yes, maybe kotma will take away mechzik mevashel because that's not the usual way to cook. Zot the Avnei Nezer have a Gemara. A boy said we'll recall from 2 weeks ago a Gemara we learned together. Kotma v'huvara. What happens if a person does ketima and then the flames burst forward again? Zot the Gemara machzirim alea. Why? Because it was kotma be'erev Shabbos. Frek the Avnei Nezer. True, that might help you to be allowed to leave the kedera there, and it doesn't negate the shia. It doesn't negate the shia. But now you want to be machzir b'Shabbos with the conditions of CHAZARA. You're putting on a kedera that's burning, katma v'huvara, and it's mutter. The only svara we have is because of hesech hadas, like we discussed in the previous limud. Hesech hadas frekt Avnei Nezer. Zach mechzik in mevashel. But then it is, it's a mufurish gemara to Taisus that the issue is Shem Yichat. Nifla. That's the kasha of Avnei Nezer. But Rabbi said, just to conclude with this, but the Avnei Nezer therefore is saying that Taisus doesn't either have a mechzik in Mevashal. Because if Taisus would have a mechzik in Mevashal, that also wouldn't be matter. Possibly Chazara on a kira that's Kotma Behuva Rabbi Shabbos. So Lo'ilam Rabbi said to conclude, the pashtus of the Balamor, the Taisus Rosh, and as we discussed in last limud, the Sefer Yosha Rabbi Yitam, is that the Rishonim are be'etzem maskim to each other. And just each Rishon is explaining a different part of the sugya. Taisus and the Sefer Yosha are focused on Erev Shabbos, and where it's not Garif and Kotum, and the Ran and the Balamor and the Taisus Rosh are focused on Chazara b'Shabbos, where it is Garif and Kotum. And therefore each Rishon needs the other. But this Botla Da'atenu to Rabbi Seinu Achreinim, that both the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and the Eglei Tal or Di'imei are mechalik, like your lashon was, into two camps, and the two are mutually exclusive svaras, and they're kashas on each side, as we saw in the Eglei Tal. This week, in the Divrei Hayomim of Klal Yisrael, the Yavitz in Siddur, in Mashar HaRavi, in Chodesh Sivan. So the Yavitz says the following. He says that on Chof Gimel Boy, which was yesterday, Chof Gimel Sivan, he says, Boy Baperek Hoisa is Tzara Li Yisrael B'Shnas Tovches. We mentioned this in last week's Limud. That these Yomim are Yemei Tzara to Yisrael, and he says, Chof Gimel Sivan, particularly he says, was an Eis Tzara. And he says, Megalgalim Choiva L'Yom Chayev. He says, why did it happen on Chof Gimel Sivan? What's Chof Gimel Sivan? Zot the Yavitz Megalgalim Choiva L'Yom Chayev. What's the Yom Chayev? What happened in history prior that makes this a Yom Chayev? Last week's Parsha, Rabbi say. The Chodesh Yomim of the Misavim, Kivras HaTaiva. The Chodesh Yomim ended on Chof Gimel Sivan, Meki Cheshbon. From the Yom that they were Neseya, and then they were Misaveh, the Chodesh Yomim, the Yavit says, finished on Chof Gimel Sivan. Ada sheyetze mi'akom. He says, Re'eva habeit ben Adam. It's not the Yavit. He says, Rabbi say, he says, Be misboinen in a musar. Ovois ochlu basar kohu shinei bonim. He says, as a result of the misavim in the midbar, years later, he says, in Tach V'Tat, the Rebbeinu Shalom was Pereya that Yom Chaya from Klal Yisrael. He says, Ein dovar b'mikra v'hizdamin. There's nothing that happens just by chance. If it happened on a certain day, it was Yom HaKagorim. He says, so what's the nechama that we have? A pella v'yayvet. He says, on Yom Chof Gimel Sivan was when Mordechai wrote the Igrois Rishonos to be Meshiv, the Gzeira of Ham. First in the Megillah. Chof Gimel in Chodesh Sivan. First in the Megillah. So he says, V'nire shehikdim HaKadosh Baruch Hu refu alamaka. The Rebbeinu Shalom anticipated the Yom Chayev in Shnas Tovches. B'Yom Zeh. Al Yedei shekosav Mordechai lahashiv sifrei ha'ach v'achema lemantia liyisrael bagolus tekuma. So that Klal Yisrael should have some survival, means of survival in Golus. Hafla of a fellow. This was the Yom in which it was a Yom Mar, a Yom Chayev Zot the Yavitz, because that was the Yom that the Misavim ended. That was the Yom of the Chodesh Yom Machi Yetzi Basar Me'apcha. It's always Ochlu Basar on Shkol Shinei Bonim. And Mele, more than 1,000 years later in Shnas Tovches, Nizgalgal Choyval Yom Chayev. But how did the Rebbeinu Shalom Kiviyochel be manhig that Leumas that there should be an Hog of Rachman? It was placed already b'shoirish b'mei Mordechai ve'Esther that Yom Chof Gimel Sivan was the Yom of the Ikris. The Cheshbon is nifla, but what do we take out of this? What's the content here? The Rambam in Igris writes that throughout the Eirach HaGolus of Klal Yisrael was challenged by the Umas Ha'olam in two ways. He says, Kol kli yutzar alayach lo yitzlach. He's explaining the pasuk in the Shivit Nechemta. Kol kli yutzar alayach lo yitzlach, but kol itoch la mishpat tarshi. But any Ummah Sa'ilam that comes against you with kalim, with arms, the Rebbeinu Shalom says will be vanquished. Anyone who comes to judge with you, Parshi, you'll condemn. What are these two things? So he says, are those epochs in history where the Ummah Sa'ilam came against Klal Yisrael, Bekalim, literally with force, with war. And then there's La Mishpat, where Klal Yisrael, where the Ummah Sa'ilam challenged the values of Klal Yisrael. Not to annihilate them, not with violence, but to challenge them with them retaining the values of what makes Klal Yisrael, L'Ummas being subject to the allure of the values of the Ummah Sa'ilam. On that, the Rambam says in Igeres, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave Klal Yisrael haftocha that arms will never ultimately succeed in Chas V'Shalom eradicating Klal Yisrael. And so too, all those who challenge your values, ultimately their values will be found empty and your values will persevere. That's what the Rambam says in Igeres. Zok the Yavetz, there will be periods in Klal Yisrael's history where Klal Yisrael will be drawn to the taiva of the Ummah Sa'ilam. Similar to the way they were drawn b'mei Mordechai ve'Esther to Sudasa shel Achashverosh. And that's the remez of Ovois Ochlu Basar. Zocharnu es ha-basar. We want that back to the Achila of Mitzrayim. We want basar. We want the Gashmias of Golus. That weakness, that liability, so to speak, that Klal Yisrael has, that's with them. We carry this. Zot the Yavetz was the same b'mei Mordechai ve'Esther. What was the antidote to that? The antidote to that was to write Igros. What were the Igros coming to be Mechadish? They were coming to Mechadish like Yehudim hoisa oira zu Torah, simcha zu yontev, sosan zu mila. To reinvigorate and to grasp onto once again what the mishpat of Klal Yisrael. What makes Klal Yisrael unique? Oira zu Torah, simcha zu yontev, sosan zu mila. The only antidote we have to not being drawn after all the beauty and all that the Ummah Sa'ilam have to offer us is an utter dedication and rededication to the values of Torah. Zot the Yavetz, the key to the preservation of Klal Yisrael in Golus, in times when Klal Yisrael would be nimshach after the mishpat of the Ummah Sa'ilam, lies in the Igros of Mordechai ve'Esther. It wasn't coincidental that in the era of Janenu Misudasa Shel Oisei Rasha, so Mordechai wrote Igros. There's an inherent connection between the two. Zot the Yavetz al yidei shekosav Mordechai lahoshiv sifrei af achema l'mantia liYisrael v'golus tkuma. So even though somehow Hatzur Tomim Pa'oloi, there had to be a puroin on that yoim of Chof Gimel Sivan, but it has its antidote already in the sheirish of the Kiyum of Klal Yisrael and goes in the Igros of Mordechai. Be'ez Hashem, it's Shabbos Mevarchim Tammuz. We are going in a certain way from the Yomim of Yimei Tzara Yisrael to the Yomim of Korikeh Sigur Ben Mitzrayim. But we always have Zot the Yavetz. We have always a tikva in Golus. We have the tikva and Golus of Oira Zu Torah, Simcha Zu Yomtiv, Sosan Zu Mila. That we reaffirm and reinvigorate the essence of what makes Klal Yisrael. We have the Haftocha, like the Rambam says in Igros, of Kol Itoch LaMishpat Tarshi, that the oilam, the values of Klal Yisrael will persevere, and in the Lashon of the Yavetz was Lamantia Li Yisrael B'Gol.